had a little mishap there. The thing came off, so he's had to clip it back on again. Otherwise, you may have difficulty hearing what we've been said. But welcome back to our presentation for this afternoon. And those who are outside, if they'd like to come in now, because you're going to miss it, and it's important that you get what we're talking about today. I just want to underline what the pastor has said. The sequence of attending these presentations are important, because if you miss one, you miss the connection to the other one. And this afternoon we're launching into the prophetic section of the book of Daniel. We've dealt with the historical section, now we're moving into the prophetic section. And you're going to move into some very heavy material. It's, the real meat. And we're looking at a series of prophecies that are following in sequence. So if you miss one, you're not going to be able to follow very easily what comes later. So this is so important to do that. So let me encourage you, and if you've missed any previous, do try and check upon the little sheets there that we have, and as he said, eventually it'll all be online. But today, strange beasts from the depths of the sea. Now, we've talked before about the tale of two cities. And those two cities, as you know, are Jerusalem and Babylon. Jerusalem was the city under siege by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Babylon was the aggressor. And these two cities have come in typological terms to represent two spiritual entities, the kingdom of God and, can we say, the kingdom of Satan. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon attacked Jerusalem, God's people. It seemed to defeat God's people. It destroyed the temple. It mocked the God of heaven. It exalted itself above the God of heaven. But eventually, God will win through. Remember the true philosophy of history, that God is in ultimate control and his purposes will eventually be fulfilled. And so we have here not just a tale of two cities, but the battle of the gods, or the contest of the gods. The true God, the living God, and Satan, who wanted to be God. And he will work through human instrumentalities, whether it's individuals or whether it's organizations, whether it's empires or even churches. He will work through these mediums, as it were, in order to carry out his purpose. But his purpose will eventually be thwarted because, as we've said and underlined this morning, it's God's purpose and plan that will ultimately succeed. So, a tale of two cities. Let's bear those foundational subjects that we've looked at in mind, because they are basic to the themes that are running through the prophetic timeline, if you like, that we're now going to be following from the 7th chapter right through to the end of the book of Daniel. Very important subjects. So, reminding ourselves once again the true philosophy of history. And you think this bloke's only got one string on his fiddle, as I keep reminding you of that, but it is so important to what we are talking about. Let's come back to what the prophet Daniel said back there in the 2nd chapter of Daniel. Daniel said, "Blessed be the name of God from age to age, for wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals the deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him." And as Daniel then stood before King Nebuchadnezzar and explained to him the meaning of that great prophecy that was given in Daniel chapter 2, he said that we will tell the kings in the interpretation. He says, "You, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven, notice, has given the kingdom, the power, the might, and the glory, into whose hand he has given human beings wherever they live, and whom he has established as ruler over them all." He said, "You are this head of gold." So in the true philosophy of history, the Most High rules. He is in ultimate control. It may sometimes seem as though Satan is winning the battle against the kingdom of Christ. But Christ is in control, and Satan can only go as far as God will allow him to go. And that happens with any power on this earth. It can only function as far as God will permit it. He allows the operation, the free choice, but God can intervene when he sees fit to do so. So men and nations, as we said this morning, have that probationary period that God gives them. And if they don't value that, that period will eventually terminate in judgment and in the destruction that will eventually follow to all the lost, to all the wicked. And we find that this is evident because Babylon, though it was defied by Nebuchadnezzar in what God said, Babylon did eventually fall and was succeeded by another kingdom, the kingdom of Media and Persia. And so just as Nebuchadnezzar was, so we are all faced with the same situation today. And everyone, therefore, must face the judgment and its outcome. And as we've just been saying, there's the spiritual entity to the typology of the historical setting. Remember, the typologies are those historical settings are examples or illustrations, is a better word, illustrations of the reality that's going to happen in spiritual terms, okay? As in this particular case. So the same is going to happen in the case of spiritual Babylon, which the Bible refers to in the book of Revelation as the harlot woman. The woman represents the church, so a fallen woman is a fallen church, as opposed to Jerusalem, which represents God's kingdom, his people. And the only two cities that are mentioned in the book of Revelation are the cities of Babylon and Jerusalem, because those are the fulfillment of the typologies of this historical section that we found here in the early chapters of Daniel. Now, I just want to illustrate something here, which is very important to demonstrate what we are saying about God having overall control. When it seems sometimes that God's kingdom may not be succeeding and that Satan is winning and we wonder where God is and what's happening and why doesn't he intervene, this is an interesting example. Winston Churchill, when he was 16 years of age, he had a vision. Now, when I say he had a vision, I don't mean as a prophet, not that kind of a vision. You know, he caught a concept, an idea of what he wanted to be when he was older, that kind of a vision. It's good for everybody, in a career to have a vision in what they're doing. And then 16 years of age, he told his friend that he had this vision of what his purpose in life was to be. And it's very interesting, it's virtually prophetic in what he said. He said, this country, the Britain, he said, this country will be subjected somehow to a tremendous invasion. And I shall be in command of the defences of London. It will fall to me to save the capital, to save the empire. Very interesting statement, isn't it? He had this premonition, as it were, that he was going to be in this position in whatever the situation was he didn't know, that was going to put this country in peril. And yet it seems that that was an intuition that maybe God may have implanted in his heart, who knows? Because if you've read the story of Churchill, and I have read his book, Churchill, he wasn't what we would call a religious man. He did believe in God and he did read the Bible, but his parents were not really godly people. His father was more interested in his parliamentary achievements, and he had no real time for his son. And his mother, she was a bit of a girl, and she, it was his nanny that taught him about the Bible, about God. And Churchill used to quote the scriptures quite a lot. And he was very impressed by some of the Old Testament stories, and he would often refer to those in his speeches and in the remarks he was making. Now, this is an interesting statement that was written by James Baker. You've all heard of James Baker, who was the White House Chief of Staff and Secretary of the Treasury during Ronald Reagan's reign, and also he was the White House Chief of Staff and Secretary of State under President George Bush. And this is what Baker said concerning Churchill's life. He says, Churchill's entire life and destiny seem to have been miraculous. Though not a religious man, he nevertheless had a sense of divine destiny. His very survival sometimes was nothing short of miraculous, and that is true as well. Likewise, both Britain's survival during the horrid summer of the 1940 Blitz and the near impossible evacuation at Dunkirk have been characterized by some as miraculous. Such a question raises the possibility of God's intervention in history and the interaction between the spiritual and the material realms. Now, I respect the fact that in the American government they seem to be more orientated to religious lines than perhaps we find in our own parliament here. Not all of them, but it seems to be the overriding case. But Baker made this interesting observation that this country somehow was miraculously protected, and it was. Because I know my grandfather, I never met him, he died before I was born, but my father told me that he used to go abroad on business. And he would have to go into Germany. And he'd pass fields and fields and fields that were just stockpiled with military machinery, planes and tanks and you name it. And he'd come back and he'd tell them and they wouldn't believe him. And the same thing was with Churchill. He warned Parliament of what Hitler was building up to. And they all thought, oh, Hitler was a good man and it would never happen. And eventually it did. Churchill got in Parliament as the, not in Parliament, he became the Prime Minister really, and he wasn't expected to be the Prime Minister. But he became the Prime Minister. And you know how people looked to him. And it seems to me that God was in control, working behind the scenes. When the odds were against Britain, people often say that the English Channel was our protector. Well, it was an obstacle to get through. But Hitler could have walked down Whitehall just as he wanted to and take command of this country. God intervened. It was a miraculous thing. And we move on here. Another statement. This statement by Carl Thomas, who actually wrote the foreword in the book God and Churchill. And he's a reporter and a political communist. And he says, columnist, sorry, not a communist, get that right. Correct myself immediately. He says, does God have a plan in human history? Does God intervene in the course of human events? Does he raise up leaders at critical junctures to save civilization? If so, was Winston Churchill one of the many deliverers who have appeared in history's arena at just the right time and place? Well, my belief on that is yes. You may disagree with me, you're at liberty to do so, but it seems as though that was in fact the case. And then Wallace Hendley, who was the co-author of the book God and Churchill, he is a journalist and a Christian columnist, as well as a White House and congressional aide. And he made this observation. He says, the most important thing I did while working at the White House was to participate in a prayer breakfast every Thursday morning in the West Wing. Those gatherings brought me into contact with people who believed that God works through the events of history. I had never thought much about that, but I was intrigued. And when Proverbs chapter 21 verse 1 says, the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord, he turns it wherever he will, was it more than simply beautiful poetry? Does God raise up leaders and bring them down, as the prophet Daniel says? Interesting observation that he made. So let's come back to Daniel. And Daniel said, as we read earlier, let's read it again, blessed be the name of God from age to age, for wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge of those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. The true philosophy of history. And let's never forget that, friends, because as I said to you this morning, there are times when we may sometimes feel a little in despair of what is happening around us, even in this country or in the world, in whatever situation we face. Let's not forget that God is the champion, and he will ultimately fulfill his promise, and he can say stop. It's not like King Canute, who thought he could command the ocean to stop and he failed. When God says that's far and no further, it can't proceed. God is in control. So, the prophecy of Daniel chapter 7. When did it take place? Well, we know Daniel chapter 2 took place sometime after the 3 years that Daniel and his 3 friends were held captive, because they had completed their training and they had been approved by the king, as we read. But it comes to a period after that, not that far after, and now later on, some 50 years perhaps, about 50 years after they were in Babylon, Daniel has this vision recorded in chapter 7. So now Daniel would perhaps be in round about the age of 70 something, maybe getting into leading up to 80 years of age, or maybe in 80, knows. Okay, gives you an idea of the period. And it's a time when Babylon was about to be taken captive. We know that because Nebuchadnezzar is no longer alive. It was during the reign of Belshazzar. Now, Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus. Nabonidus was the ruler of Babylon, the first king then, after Nebuchadnezzar. But Nabonidus was not interested in ruling. He was interested in the arts, in expeditions and archaeology and research in those sort of areas. He was more interested in the arts, whereas he put his son Belshazzar on the throne to look after the kingdom for him. That's why in Daniel chapter 5, isn't it? When he was made, when the handwriting appeared on the wall, that's why Belshazzar said, "Whoever can interpret the writing on the wall, I will make the 3rd ruler in the kingdom." That'd be the 3rd ruler, because Nabonidus was the first, Belshazzar was the second, and so Daniel would become the 3rd ruler. But that was the promise. So Babylon is about to be taken because it's now in the time of King Belshazzar. Now, all expositors of note agree that Daniel chapter 7 runs in parallel with the prophecy of Daniel chapter 2. We need to bear that in mind too. As I've said, Daniel chapter 2 is really the platform upon which Daniel 7 is built. In fact, all the prophecies that follow on from Daniel and into Revelation, they sort of are an extension of the prophecies of Daniel chapter 2. Daniel gives that panoramic survey of the future, while Daniel chapter 7 invites a much deeper investigation into these things. Daniel chapter 2 was given from a political viewpoint, whereas Daniel chapter 7 is from heaven's viewpoint. And we'll notice this as we move along now, because we are now beginning to look from heaven's viewpoint. This is showing us what God is telling us is going to happen and how he will deal with everything. Daniel 7, therefore, opens the prophetic section of the book. You'll find that chapters 1 to 6 deal with the historical section, whereas chapters 7 to 12, they are the prophetic section. By the way, while in the first 6 chapters you've got the historical section, there are 2 prophecies. One we dealt with this morning in chapter 4. Remember the humiliation of King Nebuchadnezzar. And secondly, the other one in chapter 2, the image representing the kingdoms of the world. But they were given within an historical setting. In Daniel 2, it was to let King Nebuchadnezzar know what was going to happen at the end of time, and it was to show that the true God of heaven was different to the gods of Babylon. So it was in an historical setting, but now we're moving away from that historical section, and we are purely going to be looking at the prophetic section of Daniel. We'll deal with history, of course, to show its fulfillment, but that's the difference. Chapters 1 to 7 were actually written in Aramaic, whereas the other chapters were written in Hebrew, and this has led higher critics to suggest that the book of Daniel was written by two different authors. Now, I don't accept that, neither does a truly biblical scholar, because higher criticism, putting it in layman's terms, is the art of picking holes in the scriptures, where people try to argue the scriptures away. They reason there must be two authors because written in two different languages. That is not the case. The reason why Daniel moved his language is a very important reason. And I will show you that reason very soon when we come to the series. Today, we're not going to look at that. That's something to find out. It's an important reason. We'll deal with it when we come to the 8th chapter of Daniel. Therefore, Daniel 7, being in Aramaic, links the historical section with the prophetic section. So, Daniel 7, which we're looking at today, will summarize, in a sense, that which has been presented before in Daniel 2, and then it paves the way for the continual description of the Antichrist meaning instead of. Anti in Greek means in place of, instead of. So Antichrist is in place of Christ, all right? Someone usurping the position of Christ, or seeking to. So it paves the way for the continual description that comes here in the book of Daniel and then in Revelation of the Antichrist and of Jesus Christ himself in the subsequent chapters. And so it tells us here, in the opening verses of Daniel chapter 7, you notice it was in the first year of King who? Belshazzar of Babylon. Daniel had a dream and visions of his head as he lay in bed. And then he wrote down the dream. He said, I, Daniel, saw in my vision by night the four winds of heaven stirring upon the great sea. Now here we're seeing symbols. You understand? Symbols. He's not talking about literal winds. He's talking about symbols. And as we've noted earlier, that winds represent warfare, strife, commotion, trouble, and so on. So he says, I, Daniel, saw in my vision by night the four winds of heaven stirring up the great sea. And four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. He says, the first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I watched, its wings were plucked up, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a human being, and a human mind was given to it. And then he says another beast appeared, a second one that looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side and had 3 tusks in its mouth among its teeth, and was told, arise and devour many bodies. And after this, as I watched, another appeared like a leopard. The beast had 4 wings of a bird on its back and 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. And after this I saw in the visions by night a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth and was devouring, breaking in pieces, and stamping what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that preceded it, and it had 10 horns. And I was considering the horns, when another horn appeared, a little one coming up among them. And to make room for it, 3 of the earlier horns were plucked up by the roots. There were eyes like human eyes in this horn, and a mouth speaking arrogantly. Now, what's happening here? Daniel is describing what he saw in vision. And the description goes on. After the little horn, he says, as I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire, and a stream of fire issued and flowed out from his presence. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood attending him. And the court sat in judgment, and the books were open. And I watched then because of the noise of the arrogant words that the horn was speaking. And as I watched, the beast was put to death, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. And as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. And as I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall never be destroyed. So the first half of chapter 7 is the description of what Daniel saw in vision. The other half, the latter half, is the explanation of what it means. But first of all, let's just remind ourselves here. Daniel saw these four winds, north, east, south, and west, beating down upon the sea, and as a result of the winds coming down on the sea, these four great beasts came up in order. First, the lion with eagle's wings, and then a bear that was lopsided with 3 ribs in its mouth, followed by a 4-headed leopard that had 4 wings of a fowl, and then came that 4th beast that was exceedingly dreadful. In fact, it was described as different from all the other beasts. It had great iron teeth and 10 horns. And then out of the 10 horns, 3 were plucked up, and a little horn arose in its place that had eyes like a man and a mouth speaking great things. And this caused great concern for Daniel, as we shall see, and then the judgment sat, and so on. Let's just pause it there for a moment. But it tells us that after seeing all this, he says, as for me, Daniel, my spirit was troubled within me, and the visions of my head terrified me. That's understandable, isn't it? He says, I approached one of the attendants, that's one of the angels that was there with him in the vision, helping him understand what it was all about. I approached one of the attendants to ask him the truth concerning all this. And so he said that he would disclose the interpretation of the matter. So the angel explains to Daniel what all this symbolism is about, what it means. And the angel said to him, he said, as for these 4 beasts, 4 kings shall arise out of the earth. That is, kingdoms shall arise out of the earth. But he says, but as for these 4 beasts, 4 kings shall arise out of the earth, but the holy ones of the Most High, that's the saints, the saved, shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and forever and ever. What do you see there? The true philosophy of history. That in spite of what's going to happen between now and then, ultimately God's saints will inherit the kingdom. Isn't that something to rejoice about? It's something that should encourage us, something to look up to, something to prepare for, friends. We should be taking these things very seriously because they're given for our benefit. And so we should seek to understand what God has given to us. If we don't, we shan't have any excuse at the end of time. But what about the symbolism here? Well, I've dealt with the symbolism initially in the introduction that we had at the beginning here, but let's just remind ourselves concerning this. As we've just seen there from what the angel said, the beasts represent kingdoms, or we would call them empires. And water. What does water represent in Bible prophecy? Well, Revelation 17:15, yes, that's right. It represents peoples. It says, the waters that you saw are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. And so, therefore, the Great Sea that is referred to there is a term that was used with reference to the Mediterranean Sea. That's where the whole history of this period of the Bible focus centers around, the Mediterranean region. Okay? So you begin to get the picture here, and winds, as we've said, represent warfare and strife and commotion and trouble. And we have an example there when God spoke to the Elamites. He said, I will bring upon Elam the 4 winds. Not talking about gale force winds, he's talking about warfare. He says, I will scatter them to all these winds, that's to the 4 corners of the earth. I will terrify Elam before their enemies and before those who seek their life. I will bring disaster upon them. I will send the sword after them. So when God uses these symbols in foretelling the future, they have a significant meaning. So when you begin to look at this, There's another symbol we need to recognize here. The fourth beast, remember, had 10 horns. What do horns represent? Well, the angel says they represent kingdoms that are within the empire. As for the fourth beast, there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth. And as for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. You know, to illustrate it this way, an empire is made up of many countries. We used to have what was known as that's right, Alma, the British Empire. And the British Empire was made up of a number of countries. I almost wish I could say the United States was one of them, but I suppose in a way it was originally part of the British Empire. They've left now, never mind. But Canada was part, Australia is still part of the Commonwealth. India was part of the British Empire. And there's a lot of countries, so different kings, if you like, horns, using the symbolism, that form the empire of the beast, using the symbolism here, just to illustrate. I'm not saying we're a beast, but we may act like it sometimes. But never mind. Anyway, we've got the symbolism. So we've got the lion with eagle's wings. We'll come to these again. The bear with 3 ribs. It's a lopsided bear, a 4-headed leopard with 4 wings, and the rather strange nondescript beast that was terrifying with iron teeth and 10 horns and so on. Before we move on and look at the explanation here, let's remind ourselves, we've already read it when I read through that half of the chapter, what Daniel saw in vision. I want you to observe the sequence of the events in this prophecy, because the sequence is important. We must understand that. Otherwise we'll get lost as we move on. Because when you go into chapter 8 and you go on into chapter 9 and 10 and 11 and 12, the sequence is there. You need to keep it before you. So the sequence of the prophecy is this: the 4 winds stirring up the Mediterranean Sea, and the 4 great beasts or kingdoms arise out of the sea. And then the lion is the first kingdom with eagle's wings. The second kingdom is the bear with the 3 tusks in its mouth. The third kingdom is the leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings of a bird. And the fourth kingdom is the nondescript, rather terrifying beast that had 10 horns. And then 3 of those horns were uprooted to make room for this little horn. The little horn came that had eyes of a man and a mouth speaking great things against God and so on. But after that had taken place, notice the judgment takes place in heaven. Very important to observe the sequence. Otherwise you get muddled up and you can get confused and get misled. The sequence is important. The judgment takes place in heaven after the little horn has arisen to power. And then the nondescript beast with the little horn is put to death. And the judgment is ended. It brings an end to the 4th beast. And it says that beast was ended, but the lives of the other beasts continued for a while. We'll come back to that point later. We'll explain what that means. But then Christ receives his kingdom. So have you got the sequence? It's a very important sequence. We'll note that again, but keep it in mind. It's important because we need to remember that as we study the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation. Now, on the screen before you, you can see the image of Daniel 2 that was given Nebuchadnezzar in his dream, and the 4 beasts of Daniel chapter 7 that was given to Daniel in his vision. And as I said, expositors of the Bible recognize that these run in parallel, because Daniel chapter 2 is the platform upon which Daniel 7 and the subsequent prophecies are built. All right? They don't run off into some other theme. They are built on the same theme. The interesting thing is that Nebuchadnezzar was given an outline of history in a very basic panoramic form. A simple description: Babylon will be followed by Medo-Persia, that will be followed by Greece, that will be followed by Rome, and then the breaking up of the Roman Empire, and finally the coming of the kingdom of Christ. That was a simple, panoramic, brief outline. But when we come to Daniel 7, there is more detail now being drawn out. It's as though Daniel now zooms in, or God zooms in the prophecies of Daniel to what Daniel saw in chapter 2, and he amplifies it, bringing in more detail, more information, more pertinent dates. In fact, when we move on to chapter 8, he's doing the same thing. He's zooming in and bringing out more information, which is very relevant for the time. You can begin to see why it's important to follow the sequence of these presentations, or you miss out. So the head of gold representing Babylon. And by the way, as I said this morning, Babylon was the chief metal of Babylon. Gold was, I mean. The temple of Marduk was lined with gold. I think some of the ancient historians, they describe how the walls and the ceiling, the floor were lined with gold, and the image of Bel Marduk was solid gold. Gold was the precious metal, and that represents the empire of Babylon, as Daniel told the king, and that is also represented here by the lion with eagle's wings. Very significant. Bear that in mind. We'll be coming back to it this afternoon. Then we have the arms and chest of silver representing the kingdom of Medo-Persia. And just as gold was common to Babylon, silver was common to Medo-Persia. And I will show you that this afternoon as well. And that represents the empire represented there by the bear, a lopsided bear, because Medo-Persia, Persia was in the ascendancy, Media was being, reduced, and eventually it became known as the kingdom of Persia. Then followed Greece, represented by the thighs of brass or bronze, depending which translation you're using, and that is represented by the four-headed leopard with the four wings. And then comes the legs of iron, represented there by that rather strange beast that had great iron teeth. The horns are extra information as he zooms in and he pulls out and expands upon this aspect of prophecy. And those are represented there by the feet of iron and clay, because you've got 10 toes, 10 horns. Iron and clay does not mix together. Some of it is strong, the clay is weak. And just as God said, Europe would try to unite together in marriage and alliances and so on, but it would not hold together. It would eventually fall apart. And then comes the description that followed in that vision of the stone that was cut out without hands, representing the coming of Christ and the establishment of his kingdom that would be an eternal kingdom. And of course, in the sequence of the prophetic vision that we saw in chapter 7 just now, you remember it ends where the saints inherit Christ's kingdom. So you can see how it amplifies on that. So what about the first beast then? All right. The first was like a lion. It had eagle's wings. And then as I watched, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a human being, and a human mind was given to it. You see, Nebuchadnezzar, on his exploits, he spent most of his reign conquering, in conflict, in battle, establishing the kingdom, building it up, the great empire. But finally, he began to settle down. And as we studied this morning in the prophecy that we had then, it said that he was now living in peace. Those days of conflict were over. And so you see a change here, where he now settles down from a sort of aggressive mode, and he stands on 2 feet like a human being. So the king of beasts and the king of birds, aggressive creatures, now he changes to a more human-like illustration here. And we know that the kingdom of Babylon was founded by Nabopolassar, his father, and in 605 BC, and Nebuchadnezzar, he took the throne in that year, and that was the first year of captivity. But Babylon finally ended in 593 BC. Just to remind you, the famous Ishtar Gate, and it was through that Ishtar Gate that Daniel and his 3 friends, along with all the other captives, would have been brought, not just on that first crusade, but on the second and third military crusades of Nebuchadnezzar, he would have brought his captives through this gate. You can't see the Ishtar Gate in Babylon today. Well, you can see the ruins of it, but the tiles that belong to the Ishtar Gate are now in the Pergamon Museum in East Berlin. So if you go to Berlin, no longer divided, fortunately, and you go in the Pergamon Museum, you'll see the tiles, the original tiles that were on there, and they've been constructed on, I presume, a wooden frame, but to show you what the Ishtar Gate looked like. All right? And you can see the various symbols that were there. And I want you to notice a particular symbol, because what do you see on these tiles? You see a lion with what? What can you see? A lion? And what's this? Eagle's wings. Can you see them? And the basalt lion that stands in Babylon today, that's been unearthed, I apologize for this picture, it's a little bit underexposed there, but these are eagle's wings coming around the side. You see, the king of beasts and the king of birds, the lion and the eagle, were symbols of ancient Babylon. Back there in the days of King Nebuchadnezzar, the lion with eagle's wings was one of the symbols of Babylon. So we can understand why God uses this. In fact, Jeremiah the prophet, when warning about the coming conflict from Babylon, he sometimes refers to it as the lion, sometimes he refers to it as the eagle. And so God is using his symbols correctly here. He used those things that were meaningful and fitted to the people. If you look on the map we have here, there's the great sea known as the Mediterranean Sea, and this is Palestine, excuse me, Egypt down here, and Mesopotamia, this land between the two rivers. That's what Mesopotamia, Potamus is the Greek word for river, Meso meaning between the two rivers. So you've got the river Euphrates, the river Tigris, and the great city of Babylon is right here on the river Euphrates. And Nebuchadnezzar was on his military campaigns through Palestine. He came down from the north. This was the Fertile Crescent. That's the route they would take. And he started to conquer Palestine. He set up his headquarters at Riblah. And he marched down here and he came to Tyre. Ancient Tyre is not the modern Tyre. Modern Tyre is located in a slightly different position today. The ancient Tyre, God said, would be thrown into the sea. It was so wicked, it would be thrown into the sea and it would never be rebuilt again. It would be a place for the spreading of nets. Now, I've been there, and I can vouch that that is the case. I took photographs. I've got photographs. Some of you will have seen those photographs a number of years ago when I did a series of the nets of the fishermen draped on the rocks of ancient Tyre. God said it would be thrown into the sea. Nebuchadnezzar came. Now, bear this in mind, because we'll come back to it this afternoon. Nebuchadnezzar came down, and he attacked Tyre. And the people of Tyre, they went out to an island, a refuge island they had, and they built in the sea stakes to stop amphibious craft coming in. And Nebuchadnezzar caused a lot of destruction, but he couldn't get out to the island, and so he finally went away. And the people came back and said, God's word has failed. Remember the true philosophy of history? God will eventually fulfill what he says. Years later, it didn't fail. It was fulfilled. I'll come back to that very shortly. So Nebuchadnezzar came down there and he took Jerusalem, he conquered Egypt, and he eventually established his empire. And here is the city of Babylon in that empire. Now, the lion with eagle's wings then. We've explained the symbolism. You can see the significance of this. And Babylon was a great empire. It had the famous Ishtar Gate that you see, the artist's impression, with a great procession way here, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. He built this for his wife. She came from the north, where it was all mountainous, and she was homesick. So he said, my dear, don't worry, I'll build you a mountain. So he built the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon, a tremendous feat of engineering. And the great palace, and you can see the Temple of Marduk. And the great river Euphrates, it flowed through the center of Babylon. So the ships coming up from the Persian Gulf could bring and do their trade. And what they did, they had sluice gates that came down through the gates and right down into the bottom of the riverbed to stop anyone coming. So if the city was under siege, they could close those gates, seal off the city. If at night time, they could seal it off to stop anyone coming into the city. In fact, there were double lots of walls. They were so wide they could ride chariots side by side on the top of the walls, and there was a moat between. It was looked upon as a Titanic, an impregnable city. It could not fall. But God said it would. In fact, 150 years before it fell, God foretold through the prophet Isaiah. And he even named the king who would do it before the king was born, King Cyrus. He said Cyrus would come from the east, and he came from Persia, all right? He would come from the east, and he said the gates would be left open, the river would be dried up, and it would fall to the Medes and Persians. 150 years before, God even named who would do it. 150 years later, in 539 BC, for some reason, they left the gates open. I'll tell you what happened. He diverted the river Euphrates into the many irrigation channels around Babylon, and he marched his troops up that riverbed. The gates were let open. He did exactly as the prophecy said. It was the night recorded there in Daniel chapter 5 when King Belshazzar was mocking the God of heaven. His grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had taken the sacred vessels from the temple, holy vessels set aside for the service of God. And he was abusing these vessels. He was filling them with intoxicating liquor, and his folk were all tipsy and drunk, and they were laughing and mocking the God of heaven. Our God is greater than their God. When this strange, mysterious finger started writing fiery letters on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. And he began to tremble at his knee. The whole banquet hall went silent as they saw these strange words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, upon the wall. What does it mean? None of the wise men could explain it. And Daniel, who obviously had retired, he was sent for, and he came. And he said, so from his presence, he said, from God's presence, the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the matter, meaning God has numbered the days of your kingdom, and what has he done? He's brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Here in the British Museum is the Nabonidus Chronicle. I think I showed you that the other week, didn't I? Put the picture of it on the screen, a cylinder, clay cylinder, inscribed in the strange letters that they use there. And it confirms not only what happened, what I'm telling you, but it also confirms the actual date when this took place. It was known as the eve of the great celebration on the 16th of Tishri. This was this annual festival that took place in Babylon. And we know from that record that represents the 13th of October in the year 539 BC. So whether they were drunk and off guard or whatever, but they forgot to close the sluice gates just as God said they would. That was the fall of Babylon. And he forgot to close the sluice gates, and the river had been diverted, and Cyrus marched his troops up the dry riverbed. And while they were feasting and mocking the God of heaven, the Persians, the Medo-Persians, were in the city. They were conquering. They were taking it over. And that night Belshazzar was slain, and Darius the Mede, remember the Medes and Persians, Cyrus put Darius on the throne, and he took the throne. And so we have that today. And so they came in, they took the kingdom. Which brings us to the next beast, which was the lopsided bear. Excuse me just a moment. He says, another beast appeared, a second one that looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 tusks in its mouth and amongst its teeth, and was told, arise, devour many bodies. And so that runs in parallel with the arms and chest of silver in Daniel chapter 2. And the Medo-Persian Empire, we know, succeeded, as we were just telling you, the kingdom of Babylon in the year 539 BC, and it lasted until 331 of that year. And just as silver is common here to ancient Persia, you can go to the British Museum. These pictures I took many years ago in the British Museum of Persian silver. It was abundant. Amulets, bowls, ornaments, gods, drinking vessels, you name it, silver. Just as gold was common to Babylon, so silver was common to the Persians. God knew what he was doing when he used the symbolism. And then the bear that was lopsided, because, you know, Persia was the stronger of the two. He wasn't initially, but he became the stronger of the two. And eventually Medo-Persian Empire just eventually became known as the Persian Empire. And the 3 tusks in its mouth, well, it doesn't tell us in the Bible what they meant, so it's obviously not that significant. But commentators have suggested, and it makes sense, that the 3 ribs or tusks in the mouth of this beast perhaps represent the chief conquests of the Persians that they made of Babylon, of Lydia, and then of Egypt. And here we see the map of the Persian Empire. It took in the empire of Babylon, and of course Persia, Medo-Persia came from the east, the northeast here, and that wider territory. So this is an even larger empire now. And then followed the third empire, the empire of Greece. He says, after this, as I watched, another appeared like a leopard. The beast had 4 wings of a bird, and on its back, and 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. So just as the thighs of brass or bronze of the image of Daniel 2 represented Greece, the next empire following Medo-Persia, we know from history, confirmed by history, was the Greek Empire, which took place in 331 BC, and it lasted until, I say about 168, because that's the demarcation date that historians usually give, the Battle of Pydna, when the Empire of Rome defeated them. But Greece was founded by Alexander the Great. Alexander wasn't great at that time. He was actually the son of Philip of Macedon, the ruler of that region. And when his father died, he took charge of that region. But then he conquered what was known as the greatest empire of the world. And in this map that you see here, you can see the extent of his empire. This whole period that took in the territory of former Babylon and of Medo-Persia, and now of Greece, the greatest empire that was known at that time. And so he became known as Alexander the Great. Now, a leopard is known for its swiftness, isn't it? It's not the fastest animal on earth. I think the cheetah is the fastest. Am I right in saying that, Mike? Yeah, the cheetah is the fastest. But the leopard is known for its swiftness anyway. And in contrast to Babylon, having 2 pairs of wings, where Babylon only had 1 pair of wings, indicates a speed at least twice as that of Babylon's conquests. But a leopard is known thus for its conquest. And here, let's notice, in 336 BC, Alexander came to the throne of Macedonia, which was a semi-Greek state, when his father died. He subdued revolts in Greece and Thrace. He thus restored order in his own kingdom. And then he set out to conquer the Persian Empire that was ruling at the time, because they were part of the Persian Empire. So here was a revolt, if you like, in the empire. In 334 BC, he crossed the Hellespont into Persian territory with only 35,000 troops. That's not many troops when you think of the size that armies have, okay, especially in those days. And the first victory was at Granicus. His second came the following year in 333 BC. Remember, you're counting down in time in BC sectors. Was the second victory at Issus. And then he conquered Tyre in 332 BC. Now, I was telling you about Tyre. They fled out to their island when Nebuchadnezzar came. And Nebuchadnezzar withdrew. And they thought, oh, great, all finished. No need to worry anymore, you know. And about 200 years later, Alexander the Great comes along and his military campaigns. In fact, if you go to Lebanon today, north of Beirut is what's known as the Dog River. And there are monuments on the cliffs and monument stones that were being placed by various generals dating not just up to the Second World War, but going before it, right back to Nebuchadnezzar and Sennacherib and some of these. You can see those monuments and those inscriptions. And Alexander the Great's inscription is there as well. He came down to attack Tyre. And what did they do? They fled to their island safety. They put their barrages up in the sea to stop amphibious craft. Alexander wasn't to be done. He commanded the buildings be pulled down that were standing, the rubble that was there to be thrown into the sea, the very dust scraped off the rocks and thrown into the sea with everything. And the causeway was built out, a mole out to this island where he marched his troops across and conquered the city. And you can go there today and you can see that causeway. I've stood there, there's bits of broken pottery, there's coins in it, there's all sorts of things there. And it's just exactly as God said would happen. And the place where ancient Tyre was is a place today for the spreading of nets. Exactly as the prophet Ezekiel portrayed. I told you, friends, God is in control. Alexander, he fulfilled Scripture right there and then. He conquered Palestine, and then he entered Egypt completely unopposed. And in 331 BC, he founded the city of Alexandria, there in the Nile Delta. And he declared himself successor to the pharaohs. And, the pharaohs were looked upon as gods. And so he was declared as a god by his troops. They hailed him as a god. And then he headed for Mesopotamia. What was Mesopotamia? That was the heart, now of the Persian Empire. And he came and he defeated them at the Battle of Arbela, and he was only 25 years old when he accomplished that far. Tremendous, isn't it? A young man, Alexander the Great. 327 BC, he invaded northwest India, but once he'd crossed the Indus River, his troops said, "That's enough, we're not going any further." They'd had enough. And he couldn't make them. He had to turn back. And so he returned to Mesopotamia with the intention of making his capital, setting it up in Babylon. But what did God say about Babylon? He said Babylon would be destroyed and never rebuilt. I've shown you the dust heaps, I think, in the previous program. He returned to Mesopotamia, intending Babylon to be his capital. But soon after he returned, in 313 BC, he died of malaria and in a drunken debauch at the age of 33. Just imagine that. It's said of Alexander the Great, he conquered the world, but he failed to conquer himself. He allowed alcohol to rule his brain, or to kill his brain, and he died of swamp fever or something, suggested malaria, whatever it was, at the age of 33. His conquests were like lightning, like the four wings of a fowl. He set out in 334 BC with 35,000 troops, and it took him just 10 years to conquer the most massive empire ever known to that time. Alexander unified both the East and the West. And later, he universalized the Greek language, which paved the way for the writing of the New Testament, which was in what we call Koine Greek, the common lingua franca of that time. When he died, what about the four heads of the leopard? Well, when he died, he left his country without a leader. And there was rivalry between his four generals, which resulted in them fighting against themselves. And the decisive battle amongst his generals took place at Ipsus in Phrygia in 301 BC. And what actually happened is they divided that empire between themselves. Seleucus received Asia from Phrygia right across to India, where Alexander had been. And then Lysimachus got Western Asia Minor and Thrace, and Ptolemy took Egypt. This was the reign of the Ptolemies, and Cassander, already governor of Macedon, was recognized as its sovereign. And so on the map here you can see there's the kingdom of Cassander, the section there, the kingdom of Lysimachus, and the kingdom of Seleucus, the Seleucids. And by the way, Seleucus is the one who wanted to rebuild, or rather build a capital to himself. He called it Seleucus. Do you know what he built it out of? The remains of Babylon. And the rest of Babylon is dust heaps today, as you see. And then Ptolemy down here in the south in his kingdom. So the empire was divided by the four heads, as it says, after his death. But then what happened? Daniel said, after this I saw in the visions by night a fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. Now this beast doesn't resemble anything that we know of. You might look at it and say, oh, that reminds me of somebody I don't like, you know. but no, the others at least had some resemblance of lions or eagles or bears or leopards or whatever. But this is a nondescript beast, exceedingly strong. It's dreadful. It had great iron teeth and was devouring, breaking in pieces and stamping with what was left with its feet. And he says it was different. Indeed it was different from all the beasts that preceded it, and it had 10 horns. Well, as we've noted, the iron monarchy of Rome, represented here by the legs of iron in Daniel 2, conquered the Greeks in 168 BC. By the way, whereas the other empires were finally established with a supreme battle, Rome gradually emerged as an empire, and that's why the historians can say it was around 168 BC when we can sort of say it became an empire. It was gradually emerging, taking charge. And so the iron teeth of the beast sort of correspond with that. And then you've got the feet of iron and clay that we see here that represent the breaking of that empire. But Rome was the empire that was in vogue during the days when Jesus came to this world. He was born in Bethlehem, and you remember it was the world that was the decree of Caesar Augustus to come and register in the census and to pay the taxes that brought Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem, where Jesus would be born according to Micah chapter 5 verse 2. Scripture was fulfilled again. And so during the time of Jesus that the Romans were in charge, and they ruled with a rod of iron, and the people, they hated the Romans. The zealots were there in an attempt to destroy the Romans. In fact, the war of the Jews that took place ended in AD 70 with Titus coming and destroying the city and destroying their temple. And then, of course, the Empire of Rome persecuted the Christians. And later, from the pagan Empire of Rome, the ecclesiastical section of the Empire of Rome persecuted the Christians as well. So here we see on the map how the Empire of Rome then took charge of the world. And even the British Isles came into the territory of this fourth empire. And it did rule with a rod of iron, as we know. In fact, Gibbon refers to it as the Iron Monarchy of Rome. My wife and I used to live virtually on the edge of Adrian's Wall, not far from Adrian's Wall up there in Northumbria when we were in Tyneside. And Adrian's Wall was a great wall that the Romans built, and they've got their, you've been there, and they've got their temple of Mithras there and so on. And there's other ruins in Walbrook, in Britain, in Gloucestershire, these areas, they have evidences and relics of the Roman conquest. Even some of our roads, like the A5, was a Roman highway. And so Rome lasted until about 476 AD, when the empire at that time had become broken, because the feet and iron and clay, as it says, it would be mixed with iron and clay. Some of it would be strong, some of it would be weak. They won't cleave together. They would try to unite together, but it wouldn't happen. And this happened because what happened, the 10 horns that you see here representing the kingdoms that the empire was divided into, as Rome began to weaken with its immorality, and Gibbon lists a whole lot of reasons why Rome declined in its power and its prestige. High taxes was another one, and immorality was another, and so on and so forth. And so eventually it wasn't able to stand up and defend itself like it used to do. And from the northeastern sector of the empire came these Aryan tribes, and they settled down here into this western part of the Roman Empire. And in settling in the western part of the empire, they began to weaken the empire and break it up. You know, if you're not united together, you're divided. And that's what happened. And these nations, they formed the nations of Europe. Should say these tribes formed the nations of Europe as we know them today. Just apart from 3 of them, but we'll talk about those next week. Now, the Roman Empire inherited the genes of the previous empires of Babylon, Persia, and Greece. If you remember when we read the description of what Daniel told us about what he saw, he said, there came the judgment, and then God brought an end to the 4th beast and to the little horn. It was finished. But he said the other kingdoms, they were allowed to go on for a little bit longer. Well, this, I believe, is the answer to that, because the various elements of the pagan concepts and practices and the cultures and architecture of those earlier kingdoms of Babylon, Medo, Persia, and Greece threaded their way through the periods of history and have been absorbed into the Roman Empire. So they lived on. But at the end, they will all come to an end. And similarly, the typologies we have noted in the historical section in the first 6 chapters of Daniel have continued throughout the successive periods of history. God's people have faced the trials of opposition and persecution, and they will continue to do so until Christ intervenes through the final judgment, when he will eventually bring these things to an end and set up his kingdom. And so, the ferocity of the 4th beast of Daniel 7 is so pertinent to these last days that the book of Revelation portrays this same beast compounded with the previous beasts of Daniel 7, but presents them in the opposite order, indicating that this beast has absorbed the heritage of Babylon, of Medo-Persia, and of Greece. And in this way, it is pictured as the most terrible of beasts. And it's there in Revelation 13, we read it here. John says, I saw a beast rising out of the sea, having 10 horns, notice, and 7 heads here. And on its horns were 10 diadems, and on its heads were blasphemous names. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Now it's in reverse order. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth like a lion's mouth. And the dragon, who's the dragon? Revelation 12:9 said it's Satan. He gave it its power and his throne and great authority. This beast in Revelation is referred to as Babylon, the mother of harlots. You know, the great harlot. The beast gives its power. The beast receives its power, from Satan. So you've got the conquest of the gods we mentioned earlier. Satan's kingdom is to war against Christ's kingdom. Begin to get the picture? You see how it's built on the prophecies of Daniel. And so, the nondescript beast of Rome, representing pagan or imperial Rome, and then moving into ecclesiastical Rome. And so, Daniel said, I was considering the horns when another horn appeared, a little one, coming up among them. To make room for it, 3 of the earlier horns were plucked up by the roots. And he says, I was considering the horns. He says, a little one coming up among them to make room for it, 3 of the early horns were plucked up by the roots. There were eyes like human eyes in this horn, and a mouth speaking arrogantly. He goes on to explain that it was speaking things against God and seeking to persecute God's people. And this little horn is arisen here. It's described as being different from the other horns. It's got eyes and it's got a mouth, and it's speaking blasphemies, and it is persecuting, and it becomes of great concern to Daniel. In fact, Daniel said this. He says, as for me, Daniel, my spirit was troubled within me, and the visions of my head terrified me. I desired to know the truth concerning the 4th beast. And notice the truth concerning the 10 horns that were on its head, and concerning the other horn, which came up to make room, for which 3 of them fell out. The horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke arrogantly, and that seemed greater than the others. As I looked, this horn made war with the holy ones, and was prevailing over them, until the Ancient One came. And then, remember the sequence, and then judgment was given to the holy ones of the Most High. And the time arrived when the holy ones gained possession of the kingdom. So Daniel was very, very concerned about this little horn. What does it all mean? What does it represent? It was of great concern to Daniel. It has been of great concern to many other Christians too. It should be of concern to us also. Next week, we shall examine the record and see what it means. I'll go back over that again next week. Those 10 Aryan kingdoms that divided up the Empire of Rome. We'll deal with that next week. Okay, so our program next week. In the morning, we'll identify the little horn. So don't miss next Sabbath morning. And then in the afternoon, we'll be having a look at the battle of the beasts. We'll be moving on into the next chapter of Daniel. All right? So that's next Sabbath. Brother, Pastor, would you like to come forward, please, brother? And I'll leave you to offer a word of prayer. Say what you need to say. Thank you. Did I change this slide? I thought I'd changed it. I don't know what happened there.
Thank you, Pastor Walker.
Doesn't seem to be going over, but never
That's
mind.
fine. That's fine.
No. Don't worry. There we are. Thank you.
Did you get on okay filling out your sheets? We're going to do that next week. I know, I think that the last few questions we sort of went over a little bit quickly if you were following the sheet. But we will go over it again next week, and we can, yeah. Okay, so thank you, Pastor Walker, for that. And as I said, we will continue next week. We will have a morning session and an afternoon session again. So please come along. For those of you from Great Yarmouth, I do want to remind you that tomorrow we have a very important event. It's called, we are going to be having a little work bee, a little clean-up at Great Yarmouth Church, starting at 10 o'clock. So please come along for that. After all this sitting today, tomorrow it'll be a good opportunity not to sit. Let me put it that way. So let us pray, and we will close off. Heavenly Father, we thank you for these important prophetic words. And Lord, again, we want to thank you that you have given these to us, and you have told us in your scripture, in Peter, that we should take heed of these things as a light that is shining in the darkness. And Lord, I pray that you would help that light to shine into our hearts. Help us to remember these things and to live them practically in our life as well. Lord, we want to commend everyone here to you and pray that you would take all of us safely home. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you all.